series, and today we'll be looking at sand dunes and how these are an example of coastlines of deposition. So before we get into sand dunes, you need to realise that the coast is a system, as we talked in the first lesson about inputs, outputs and processes, but also beach sediment is also within a system known as the beach sediment budget. And we have inputs, outputs and processes in the beach environment as well. So change in one part of the system can impact upon other parts of the system, and therefore it's interlinked. There's actually a formula that goes with sediment budget, and this is shown by the blue formula here, where O is the output of sediment from the system, I is the input, and this triangle shape, which is a Greek letter delta, D, delta S means the change in storage within the system. So the output from the system is a direct result of inputs plus any changes. So you need to perhaps pause the video and have a little think about sediment and like sand and shingle, and how in a beach environment what might happen if inputs were less than outputs to the dune or the beach. So the number of questions down here that you might want to consider, and you might want to pause the video, have a little think, and then come back when you've understood that. So welcome back. So here we have typical beach there with some very sandy cliffs that are falling into the sea here. As you can see, you've got some kind of grass at the back here, and a very quickly eroded coastline here. So we have, on this particular environment, we have 3 inputs shown by the arrows in blue, and we have 2 outputs. So in this case, the main inputs are erosion from the cliff, onshore transport of sediment by the sea, and longshore drift along the coast, transporting sediment from elsewhere. We have other inputs as well. For example, there could be a river in this environment, or there might be windblown sediment, but these are the 3 main inputs. Outputs in this case, longshore drift if it continues down the coast, and if you have a storm or you have a particularly destructive wave, you might have offshore transport of sediment as well. Again, the wind can blow sediment away. Human beings can remove sediment on purpose or by accident, for example, if we do dredging or if we use beach sediment to re-nourish a beach, but these are the sort of main inputs and outputs to this system. So when we're thinking about typical environments of erosion, transport and deposition, one of the main environments that we talk about with transport and deposition are sand dune ecosystems, and these are, well, hopefully you know what sand dunes are, but generally speaking they are accumulations of sand shaped into mounds by the wind. We see these in inland areas like the Sahara and the Kalahari, and these are areas where there used to be oceans, but obviously there are no longer. So if you see sand dunes inland, you know there used to be an ocean there. Anyway, in the sand dunes at the coast, which is the ones we are interested in, accumulation occurs because of a obstacle on the land. Wind blows some sediment, sand usually, behind this little obstacle, and they start to build up. This obviously takes hundreds of thousands of years. Sand dunes don't grow overnight, and if you're lucky, I suppose you can look at it that way, plants will start to colonise the sand dunes, which might lead to a sand dune ecosystem, which is known as a Psammosere. So if you see, note here this silent P at the start of this word, so make sure you know how to spell this. Psammosere means a sand dune ecosystem made up of sand dunes and typical plant species, which we will talk about in this lesson. So this diagram here just gives a very brief summary of what happens over time in a sand dune ecosystem before one has even formed. So we've got our sand accumulating against a feature. It could even be a piece of litter or a rock that small, and as time goes on, the wind speed drops behind the little obstacle because it's sheltered from the onshore winds, so accumulation occurs of material. Once you get some pioneer species where windblown seeds start to colonise that sand, then you start off your sand dune ecosystem. Marram grass is shown on the diagram here, or is given as an example, but marram grass is actually not a pioneer species really. It's an early species in a sand dune ecosystem, but it normally comes after other species which are very, very hardy. So as time goes on, different plants make the environment more stable, soil starts to form, and ultimately, over time, additional species form. So here we have a picture of a Psammosere with various species occurring over time. So the seaward side of a sand dune is known as the strand line. The strand line is the line where the tide comes into that leaves behind material. So if you walk along the strand line on a beach, this is where you'll find driftwood, pirate treasure, that kind of thing. So the strand line is the high tide line, basically where the ocean deposits, waves deposits stuff. Sadly, these days, a lot of plastics are found on the strand line, but anyway, you get the point. So at the strand line, you might have if you've got a sand dune ecosystem forming, you might find a species like sea rocket, which is a very, very, very hardy species because it obviously has to withstand occasionally being inundated by the sea. It also has to withstand exceedingly dry conditions. There's no soil. It's growing in the sand, and it also has to withstand exceedingly strong onshore winds. So when you go to the sea in windy places, you notice that all the trees are sort of look like they've been blown inwards, like when you have your hair in the wind. So that's what they look like. So this is what species like sea rocket have to put up with. Sea rocket is a very low-lying plant. It's known as a prostate plant because it's close to the ground. Once sea rocket turns up, things like couch grass might appear due to the sea rocket making the environment binding the mud and sand together to make a little bit of soil. So the first dune, the closest to the sea, is known as the embryo dune, and embryo meaning sort of the baby dune, I suppose, that kicks the whole thing off. And once you get couch grass, which is shown here on the embryo dune, you're away unless an enormous storm comes and washes it all away. The next dune inwards is known as the fore dunes, and these might have this grass, marram grass that we were talking about. Even further inland, yellow dunes, sedge grass, the fixed dunes with red fescue, scrub if you're lucky, and then finally, over time, you might end up with what's known as the climatic climax community. And in the UK, the climatic climax community is mixed oak woodland. Now, you're probably thinking there's a lot of terminology in here, and you might want to pause the video at this point and have a look at this slide a little bit more. But obviously, all these dunes are not going to form all at the same time. So the dune that the woodland and oak woodland may be on is obviously the oldest dune. And as time has gone on, the dunes develop seaward. So basically, this was the original embryo dune here. Because of that dune, or maybe because of some change in the sea, maybe sea level, the next dune in front of that will become the embryo dune, and that would now become the yellow dune further back. So over time, new dunes form in front, moving seaward, and these dunes at the back are the oldest dunes with the most established communities on them. So obviously dunes do travel because most winds are onshore. So dunes, apart from forming at the top of the beach, these dunes also do travel, but once you have vegetation on the dunes, they're more stable because the roots of the trees obviously keep the dune where it is. So in an ecosystem where humans have not got involved and messed with the system or damaged it in any way, over time, over thousands of years, a Psammosere might develop to become a mixed oak woodland with all these other types of species and environments in between. If human interference does take place, for example, if cattle are allowed to graze inland in the oak woodland, or any other building takes place or anything like that, then the climatic climax community won't be reached, because basically it takes a long time for oak trees to grow. So if you interfere with that system, you get what's known as a plasioclimax, which is some form of ecosystem which is not the end result that it would be in the UK. So it could be mixed kind of species of faster growing trees like ash and elder. It could just be scrubland. It depends, basically. In the UK, it's very rare to actually see oak woodland like this in a climatic climax community, because we've over time with our farming and things like that, farming practices, we have cut down the majority of our original oak woodland, so you don't really see this in the UK that often. So if you're looking here at a sort of long profile here of a sand dune ecosystem, again here's the strand line with the lowest dunes and the ocean here on the left, and you can see each dune here with its special name, the embryo dune, the fore dune, mature dunes and the heath woodland here in a nice environment like this. And then the section here called a blowout, which is just where the wind has kind of scooped out the vegetation and made little sort of hollows in the sand. You see those when you're on a sand dunes, you'll see those. And we have Dune Slacks here as well, which are areas between the dunes which have more moisture in them and different plant species. So if you, perhaps in your field work, wanted to undertake some beach kind of field work where you might want to do a transect of from sea to inland to check how species change as you move inland, you will be looking out for these kind of species on the different types of dunes, and also you will be looking out for Dune Slack species. So an example title for your fieldwork might be the sand dunes at beach X are typical of a UK British Psammosere. That might be your title, and then you would go and investigate whether indeed this was the case. So in a Psammosere ecosystem like this, you need to have a suitable supply of sand. Initially, you need a drying onshore wind, you need vegetation to turn up, and you need an obstacle for it all to kick off. If you don't have those things, you will not get this system of sand dunes. The soil colour changes as well as you move inland. White, yellow sand basically is not really a soil. Once the plants turn up, we get a kind of greyer soil to a more typical brown soil that you would see in other places that aren't sand dune ecosystems. Again, you would see a greater increase in acidity from the alkaline environment by the sea to the more acidic environment inland. These are the oldest part of the dunes, these are the newest parts of the dunes. Increasing humus doesn't mean the lovely stuff that you might put on bread. It means plant material, organic matter, and the more diverse the number of species. Here's some pictures to help you visualise that environment. So we've got obviously the sea here at the seaward side of this sand dune ecosystem. An embryo dune here with just a little scrubby little species here trying desperately to cling on to life. On the fore dunes, we've got some marram grasses here. Yellow dunes, we've got some grasses but also some different species down here, and we're going further back, we're going further inland. At the grey dune here we can see some grass species, some lichens, a lot more variety basically in species. Here's a Dune Slack area of water, so around that area of water, and even if you don't see water, the land see as in with your eyes water, the land will have greater moisture content because it's protected from the wind, and obviously water will run off into this Dune Slack. Here's like a little valley, so you will get a different range of species here. And here we have the mature dunes at the back of the beach, and in this case you can see here it looks like coniferous woodland, so we have not reached the climatic climax community here. These trees are not the climatic climax community in England and Wales. These are species that we plant. In Scotland it might be different because the climatic climax community might comprise conifers like this, but this looks like a plantation rather than what would happen naturally. So here again you can see an aerial view of a sand dune. So this is like a satellite photograph with labels on it. So you see the ocean here, the strand line, you can see sand here obviously has been deposited. The strand line again, the high water mark. The Embryo and Fore Dunes are moving inland. Again we see our move towards our oldest dunes at the back of the beach there. And yes, this is sort of how you might show what transect you might be doing if you choose to do something like this on your field work. So this is my transect from X to Y, and I would be using my quadrat and my sampling tables and my species identification charts to log what I see walking on a transit from the sea inland. I could do that. You could do that. So here is the transect here, and it's so with our pioneer species, and our changes in acidity and soil organic matter to our climax community. And this is just sort of laying this transect alongside this cross profile of a typical idealized transect. So if we look in a little bit more detail now on each of the kind of dune and dune slack environments along that transect in a typical Psammosere in the UK, you can see here we're on the Embryo and Fore Dunes. So it's a very, very harsh environment for plants. So we have onshore winds, we have storms, we have occasional inundation by the sea. Inundation means getting flooded by the sea, basically. So any species that lives here needs to have deep tap roots. It needs to be able to withstand high winds. It needs to be able to put up with being underwater sometimes, and it needs to be able to put up with extremely salty environments and exceedingly, well, it's got a pH of 7, so actually there's a neutral soil here. And this percentage OM stands for percentage organic matter. And as you can see, a typical Embryo and Fore Dune environment has very low organic matter. Organic matter is what plants need to get their nutrients. So these plants that are here are able to survive. They are pioneers. They're able to survive on very low amounts of nutrients. As we move back, oh no, we're still on our Embryo and Fore Dunes here. So we see some of these species we talked about. These are what they look like: sandwort, saltwort, sea couch, and sea rocket. They're very, very brave plants, really, and very strong plants, even though they don't look it. How they withstand the environment we talked about earlier. Waxy leaves, so they don't lose a lot to evapotranspiration. Thorn-like leaves, again, thin leaves, so they're not got large surface area. They also might be quite spiky to stop predators eating them and destroying them once they've gone to all that effort to stabilise themselves in that environment. They're prostrate, which means they're low to the ground. And we talked about deep tap roots and having high salt tolerance already. So at this stage, when in the formation of a sand dune Psammosere, you see that the seeds are blown in by the wind or washed in by the sea. And if rain occurs, obviously that might allow the seed to become a sapling, basically, and the whole thing kicks off from that point. Slightly further in now from the sea, so the first set of dunes in after those embryo dunes, you can see that the pH has dropped, so we're getting more acidic. Organic matter has risen slightly. We've got lower wind speeds. We're above the level of the high tide, so any species that are formed here will not have to put up with being inundated by the sea, but they will have to still contend with high salt in the wind. So there'll be salt on them, on their leaves and on the ground, and they'll also still have to put up with high like windy environments. So there's some humus forming, so these plants do kind of bind the mud and sand together to make sort of a rudimentary soil, and that allows them to become more stable and allows the nutrient level to build up so that other plants can start to colonise. So marron grass is the dominant species on these yellow dunes, and marron grass is probably a species that you really will recognise. It's very spiky grass and kind of forms in clumps, not like grass on your lawn, and you will have no doubt seen those types of grasses on dunes. Other species that you might see are things like this: ragwort and red fescue and sand sedge, but the most common is marron grass, and it's very, very good and efficient at putting up with the harsh but less harsh environment on the yellow dune. So once these plants like marron grass turn up, they basically increase the amount of organic matter in the soil. They obviously offer shelter as well from the wind, where other plants can grow behind them on the leeward side of the plant. And you can actually see the change in colour on this type of dune, because the sort of yellowy white sandy look disappears and they start to sort of become a bit more grey looking, and that's to do with the amount of organic matter. The amount of organic matter is increasing, so they tend to look more grey because that's a mix of sand and soil, essentially. So once we get further inland to the grey fixed dunes, you'll start to see here that we have much more species variety, so the ecosystem has become a lot more varied, and we've got lots more different plants. The pH has lowered again, and we've got more organic matter again. We've got more nutrient supply, better water retention in the soil, so lots more plants that are less tolerant are able to grow and survive in the environment. We're further from the ocean as well, so the wind speeds have dropped. We're probably not getting as much salt on the soil, which is I think some plants find that exceedingly difficult. We've got shelter as well from the dunes that are closer to the ocean, which is quite nice. A typical plants that you might find here: creeping willow, dewberry, red fescue. You can see the red fescue here, the reddy kind of colour. And you also might start to get some lichens, which are those flat kind of scaly plants. You see them on trees as well. And some heather, which is another kind of species that can cope in quite harsh environments. So lichens come in many colours, but they sort of give the ground a sort of grey appearance. Marram doesn't, it's not that it can't survive in this environment, but it will be outcompeted by the other plants. So due to the species diversity, it will become outcompeted. So marram grass grows better where it can colonise by itself, basically. So you still get marram grass, but not as much. So as we get towards the rear of the sand dune ecosystem, the furthest sand dune away from the sea, we might get to that climax stage, the climatic climax. So in the UK, we talked about this. We might get oak woodland, we might get scrubby kind of bramble and gorse, we might get other species like that. And once the trees turn up, they outcompete the lower growing plants for light and water. So once a tree establishes itself, basically plants that grow underneath in the understory are going to find it difficult unless they're shade tolerant, and therefore you don't find so many of those species. So when the water table, which is the level below the ground at which the rocks are saturated, the water table is higher towards the landward side of the beach because there is more soil to contain the water. So towards the sea, there isn't much soil. So as you know, if you try and build a moat around your castle on a very sandy bit of beach, the water disappears, doesn't it? It just disappears into the sand. But if you have soil further inland, the water table is higher, the soil is more full of moisture, and therefore you might also find you get dune slacks, which are in between the dunes, and plants which are specially adapted to be water tolerant might grow there. So here's a dune slack environment. We've still got an acidic soil here, but we've got a high water table. Sometimes this results in standing water above the surface, not all the time, but we have to plants again here that are tolerant of being in water, not salt water admittedly, but they have to tolerate having their roots in water, and not all plants can do that. So again, we have a dune slack environments are very unique. So I hope you're getting the idea that Psammoseres are very unique ecosystems, and that's why so many sand dune ecosystems are protected by boardwalks and fences to stop people walking on them. They're very delicate environments because it's a harsh environment, a bit like the Arctic or it's a harsh, difficult environment, and they have a very unique set of species which you do not find in other parts of the world or in other parts of the UK. So we try to protect them. So in the dune slacks, we might get some of these plants which are very kind of water tolerant. So you might recognise some of these from typical wetland areas. So rushes like this are plants that often grow by rivers, or by lakes, and they can tolerate being partially submerged. Bog cotton, bogs because they grow in bogs. Reeds, obviously you'll recognise perhaps reeds from rivers and the side of canals because they have their roots submerged in water. And flag iris, so a type of iris that grows in water. So we're getting towards the back of the beach now. So here we are, we're getting to the kind of Dune Heath or woodland. We're not quite in the climax community, we're getting to it. We've got very acidic soil now, pH 4. Organic matter's up at 12% though, so species that find the harsher environments closer to the sea difficult will start to find this environment quite attractive. So we've got high organic matter here. It's nutrient-rich environment. So we still have a marine influence, but it's minimal. So we're going to see different sort of species accumulating here. What might we see? We might see heather, sea buckthorn. We might see, ultimately, we might see pine, birch and oak trees, which are the climatic climax community. So this slide is a summary of those Psammosere stages, which I have rattled through very quickly. This is probably a video to watch twice. This is probably a part of the video to pause and make sure that you understand how the dune succession occurs. On the paper 2 years ago, there was a question asking what contribution deposition had to an environment that was shown on the paper, and the environment shown was a sand dune ecosystem, and students did rather well at talking about how deposition had led to that environment, but most students forgot to talk about how the dune environment was also a result of the plants. So they talked about the coastal processes, i.e. the transport of the sediment, the wind blown behind an obstacle, but they forgot all about how the plants contribute to this environment. So just to summarise, you do not get a Psammosere, a sand dune ecosystem, unless plants turn up. You get dunes, but you don't get this Psammosere, which is the ecosystem around that. The plants are important at stabilising the dunes. If the plants don't come, the dunes get blown away by the wind or washed away by the sea. So it's the fact that the plants come, and we have the succession of different communities depending on the environment that allows that environment to stabilise and become a Psammosere. So we're going to look in more detail in class at typical Psammoseres. We're going to do a little case study. We're going to make sure that we understand what these species are. We're going to make sure that we understand the kind of progression of a Psammosere formation. So perhaps watch this video again, maybe do a little bit of Googling, look on YouTube, but in class we'll be doing more work on this. Just make sure you have good notes at this stage, and I'll see you back in class.